"Old man, if you don't pay today, don't expect to walk out of here." Annie Carter stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, her fingers instinctively tightening around the brown envelope tucked inside her coat pocket. Shouting echoed from a narrow alley beside a closed barber shop. A man in a black leather jacket stood at the entrance, with two others behind him. He was broad-shouldered, his jaw clenched tight, and the gold chain around his neck caught the streetlight whenever he leaned forward. "Did you hear me, old man?" he hissed, each word sharp enough to carry out onto the street. "I said today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today." Annie should have kept walking, but she stopped. From near the mouth of the alley, she saw three men surrounding a stranger. The man they had cornered was sitting against a brick wall with one knee drawn up. An unfinished loaf of bread rested in his hand. He looked to be in his 50s, white, with an unshaven face. His gray coat was torn at the sleeves, and his shoes were so worn that the soles were peeling apart. He continued chewing the stale bread slowly, as if it were his first meal in days. When Annie first noticed him, she heard him muttering to himself. "Idiot," he murmured. "Should have known better. Trusted the wrong people." There was bitterness in his voice, but not madness. It was shame. The man in the leather jacket stepped closer. "You borrowed money," he said coldly. "Now pay it back." The man on the ground raised one hand, palm outward. "I know. I'm not running from it. I just need a little more time." "You've already had enough time. I can work it out," the man replied, trying to stay calm. "Give me a few days, maybe a week. I'll pay everything back." One of the men behind the leader laughed. "Listen to him. Still talking like he has options." The seated man swallowed hard. "Please, just give me a little more time. I'll repay it all." The man in the leather jacket leaned down closer. "We don't run charities." Annie unconsciously took a step forward. The man sitting on the ground saw her and gently shook his head. "Miss, don't get involved." But Annie was already too close to pretend she hadn't heard. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Why are they treating you like this?" The man looked startled, as if her question hurt more than the threats. He lowered the bread onto his lap. "They're creditors," he said quietly. "I owe them money. They came to collect." The man in the leather jacket turned to Annie with a slow smile. "Well, you heard him. Now keep walking." Annie looked at the three men, then back at the man leaning against the wall. "If he owes money, you can still handle this like decent people. You don't have to push him this far." The leader's smile widened. "Decent people pay their debts. He's only asking for more time. And I already said no." Annie pulled out her phone. "Maybe the police can help settle this." No one moved. Then the leader threw his head back and laughed. When he looked at Annie again, the amusement was still in his eyes. "Go home, little girl," he said. "Or what? You want to play hero? You want to save him?" The other two men chuckled. Annie's thumb hovered over her phone screen, but her hand began to shake. The leader noticed. "That's the problem with people like you," he said. "Always wanting to call someone. Always trying to act brave. But when it's time to pay the price, everyone disappears." Annie took a deep breath. "Why won't you give him more time? He only needs a few days." "We don't run a charity," one of the men replied. The leader pointed at the man on the ground. "If you feel so sorry for him, pay his debt." Annie froze. "I don't have much money," she said softly. "I can't pay someone else's debt." The leader's eyes suddenly dropped to the brown envelope sticking out of her coat pocket. When she had reached for her phone, she had accidentally pulled it halfway out. He smiled. "What's that?" Annie immediately pressed the envelope against her chest. "It's not for this." The man in the leather jacket stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough to make the air feel heavy. "Money is money." "It's for school," one of the other men scoffed. "School can wait. Debt can't." The man sitting on the ground quickly looked up. "No, don't do it." The leader's face hardened. He glanced at the man against the wall, then back at Annie. "Are we done here?" he snapped. "I have things to do. Either the debt gets paid now, or we handle this our own way." Annie swallowed. "If I pay for him, will you leave him alone?" The leader narrowed his eyes. "That's usually how payment works." "No." Annie lifted her head. Even she was surprised by how firm her voice sounded. "I mean, you leave him alone completely. No following him. No coming back tonight. No sending your friends after him." One of the men laughed. "Now she's making demands." Annie stared straight at the leader. "Write it down." The smile vanished from his face. Write what down? A receipt. A note. Anything proving the debt has been paid. And you won't bother him again. The man in the leather jacket stared at her for a long moment, then let out a short laugh. You're bold. I'm careful, Annie replied. If I'm giving you money, I want proof. The man on the ground kept shaking his head. Please don't do this. But Annie never took her eyes off the leader. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded piece of paper and a pen, then tossed them to one of the men behind him. Write it, he said coldly. Paid in full, no more collecting tonight. Annie shook her head. Not just tonight. His jaw tightened. You're asking for too much. And you're getting paid. The alley suddenly fell silent. The leader stared at Annie as if he couldn't decide whether to laugh at her or curse her. Then he snatched the paper back. Fine, he said. You want paperwork? He looked straight at her. I'll give you paperwork. He pressed the paper against the brick wall and began writing. His handwriting was rough, jagged, and harsh just like the man himself, but Annie still read every line carefully. Receipt and debt settlement agreement. Date, March 14. Location, alley beside Peachtree Barber and Cuts. Atlanta, Georgia. Debtor, Charles Whitman. Debt amount, $800. Debt collector receiving payment, Vince Mallory. The above debt shall be paid in full by a third party on behalf of the debtor. Upon receiving the full amount of $800, the debt will be considered fully settled and paid. Vince Mallory and any of his associates shall not engage in any further debt collection activities, threats, visits, or claims related to Charles Whitman regarding this debt. Annie read it once, then she read it again. Write your phone number here, she said softly. The man in the leather jacket looked at her as if she had lost her mind. What? If this is real, leave me your phone number. He let out a snort, but eventually bent down and wrote a number beneath his name. Now sign it, Annie said. He signed with a hard stroke, the pen digging across the paper as if he wanted to tear it apart. And him too, Annie nodded toward one of the men standing behind him. I need a witness. The other man muttered something under his breath, but the leader turned and barked at him. Sign the damn paper. The man reluctantly took the pen and signed. Annie held out her hand. Give it to me first. The man in the leather jacket immediately lifted the paper out of her reach. Money first. No. Annie shook her head. Paper first. Then the money. He stared at her. Annie held his gaze. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Finally, he shoved the paper into her hand. The sheet was thin, wrinkled, and creased. But everything was still there, the names, the amount, the date, the agreement, and the signatures. Annie carefully folded it once. Then she placed it beside the envelope containing her scholarship money. The man held out his hand. All right, he said coldly. Now it's your turn. Hand over the money. Annie tightened her grip on the signed document in her hand and looked down at the scholarship envelope pressed against her chest. In that moment, the narrow alley seemed to close in around her. The words on the paper stood out clearly. Charles Whitman. $800. Paid in full. No further collection, threats, or contact of any kind permitted. Vince had signed it. One of his men had signed as a witness. It should have made Annie feel relieved, but it didn't. Charles was still sitting against the brick wall, holding a half-eaten piece of bread. His eyes were fixed on the envelope as if it were the most precious thing he had ever seen. He spoke softly. Miss, you got the paperwork. Go. Don't worry about me anymore. Vince let out a dry laugh. That's not how life works. Annie opened the envelope. Her fingers froze. She pulled out the cash from her scholarship advance and began counting. 100, 200, 300. The bills were crisp and neatly folded, just as the financial aid officer had handed them to her. Annie had imagined laying them out on the kitchen table at home so her mother, Ruth, could see that sometimes good news really did come in the form of thin sheets of paper. 400. She thought about the rent. 500. Groceries. 600. A monthly bus pass. Used textbooks. The lab fee she had never told her mother about because she didn't want Ruth to worry any more than she already did. When she reached the 7th bill, her chest suddenly tightened so hard that she had to stop breathing for a moment. The last $100 bill remained between her fingers. She looked at it, then at Charles, then at Vince's outstretched hand waiting for her. Her courage began to waver. Annie pulled the money back against her chest. The smile disappeared from Vince's face instantly. "What are you doing?" Annie swallowed hard. I just need a little more time." Vince stepped closer. "You don't have any time left." He held out his hand. "You wanted the receipt. I wrote it. Now give me the money." Charles pushed himself upright. "Leave her alone. Tear that paper up if you want. I told her not to get involved." Vince turned sharply toward him. "You don't get to speak here." Annie's hands trembled. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, not angry, just tired. "Annie, sweetheart, what have you done?" She lowered her head. "I can't." Vince frowned. "What?" Annie tightened her grip on the money. "I said, I can't." One of Vince's men muttered behind him. "Hey, we don't have time for this." Vince snatched the envelope but still didn't touch her. His voice turned cold. "Listen, girl, you threw yourself into this. You made me write papers like we were sitting in some bank office. Now you want to back out?" Annie looked up. Her eyes were red, but kindness had never been easy. Charles looked at her, his voice so soft it almost disappeared into the air. "Keep the money, please." He paused. "No matter what happens to me, don't give them your future." Future? The word caught in Annie's throat. For her, the future had never been something certain. It had always felt like a door that was about to close while she ran as fast as she could to keep from being left behind. Then she looked at Vince, and she knew he would never walk away with a moral lesson. He had come to collect a debt from a man who had nothing left. And now, Annie was the only thing standing between Charles and whatever would happen next. Annie closed her eyes, just for half a second. Then she pushed the last $100 bill back into the stack. Vince lost his patience. "That's enough." Annie opened her eyes. She held out the money. "Here." Before fear could pull her hand back, she placed the entire stack into his hand. Vince grabbed it immediately, as if he thought she might change her mind. Then he began counting. Slowly, one bill at a time. His fingers slid over the paper. Annie stood there and watched the rent disappear. The textbook money disappear. The grocery money disappear. The bus fare disappear too. And the relieved smile she had imagined on her mother's face disappeared with it. If Annie's kindness touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about hope, courage, and humanity. When he finished counting, Vince folded the money. He tapped the signed paper in Annie's hand. "Paid in full." He smirked. "Just the way you wanted." Annie tried to keep her voice steady. "You signed it. Your witness signed it too. I know what I signed. And you won't come back for him again." Vince looked at Charles, then at Annie. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, and maybe even respect he didn't want to admit. "With this debt, we're done." Annie tightened her grip on the paper. "You wrote that." Vince shrugged. "Then read it every night if it helps you sleep better." He turned and walked away. His men followed behind him, laughing quietly. At the end of the alley, Vince stopped. He looked back at Annie. "Be careful, hero." He smirked. "One day, your heart will cost you more than money ever could." Then they disappeared. The alley fell silent again. For a long time, no one said anything. Annie remained standing there. Charles didn't move either. The city stretched out before them beneath a sky of gloom and decay. Annie folded the signed paper once, then again, carefully slipping it back into the envelope that no longer held her future. Charles stood there silently, watching her. His eyes were so deep and unreadable that Annie couldn't tell what he was thinking. "I don't know what to say anymore," he said softly. Annie looked up at him. She wanted to smile and brush it off. She wanted to say that everything was fine. But the truth was, nothing was fine. And she was still too young to be good at hiding her pain. "You can start by telling me your name." The man lowered his head for a moment. "Charles Whitman." "Annie Carter." He nodded slightly. "Miss Carter." He spoke her name slowly, as if it deserved respect. "I'm sorry." Annie let out a faint laugh. It was not a happy one. People always say they're sorry after the money is already gone. Charles stayed silent for a few seconds, then nodded slowly. "That sounds fair." Bus route 68 pulled up to the stop at the end of the street. Annie watched the doors open. A man carrying a lunchbox stepped aboard. A mother bent down to adjust her son's backpack before helping him onto the bus. An elderly woman carefully climbed the steps and smiled as she thanked the driver. Out of habit, Annie slipped her hand into her pocket. Then she froze. There were only a few coins left inside. Not enough. The bus doors closed. The bus slowly pulled away, leaving her behind. Charles followed her gaze. That money was important to you, wasn't it? Yes, sir. The words came out almost automatically. That was how her mother, Ruth, had raised her. Her mother always said, being polite isn't about whether others deserve respect. It's about whether you deserve to remain kind. Charles lowered his eyes slightly when he heard the word sir, as if it made him uncomfortable. What was the money for? Tuition, Annie replied. Rent, food, bus fare, all the boring things rich people never think about and poor people pray over every month. Charles stiffened slightly. I'll pay you back. Annie almost laughed again. She looked at his worn-out coat, his scuffed shoes, and the loaf of bread still in his hand. With what? Charles opened his mouth to say something, then fell silent. Whatever answer he had seemed meaningless in that cold alley. I don't know, he finally admitted, and somehow, that honesty softened something inside her, though it still wasn't enough to ease the aching emptiness pressing against her chest. Annie looked around. People were passing the alley now without glancing in. A few minutes earlier, 3 men had been threatening a man in broad daylight. Now it was just another piece of city noise nobody wanted to claim. Do you have somewhere to go? She asked. Charles did not answer. That silence said more than words. Annie rubbed her forehead. Tomorrow would be terrible. Her mother would ask about the scholarship, and Annie would have to explain how the envelope went from blessing to emptiness in less than an hour. Mr. Hanley would still want rent. The college would still want receipts. The refrigerator would still be close to bare. But Charles, sitting in that alley after she had paid his debt, made no sense either. Come on, she said. Charles looked up. Where? My apartment isn't far. You can clean up, eat something, and rest. After that, we'll figure out the rest. Miss Carter, I can't ask that of you. You didn't. That doesn't make it right. Nothing about today is right. He looked away, ashamed. I don't want to bring trouble to your home. Annie paused. Are those men coming back? Not for that debt. That's not what I asked. Charles held the bread in both hands now, no longer eating it. I don't know. She studied him. There was something he was not saying, something larger than $800. But she was too tired and too shaken to pull secrets from a stranger in an alley. Then we won't stay out here discussing it, she said. They walked toward the sidewalk. Charles rose slowly and tried not to show how stiff he was. Annie shortened her steps. He noticed. You don't have to slow down for me. I'm not. Yes, you are. Then let me be polite in peace. For the first time, his mouth moved like it might become a smile. It disappeared quickly. But Annie saw it. They passed the bus stop, the laundromat, a pawn shop with old guitars in the window, and a small Baptist church with a sign out front that read, God sees the forgotten. Annie had passed that sign 100 times. Today, it felt less like comfort and more like a question. Charles read it too. Do you believe that? He asked. Annie kept walking. Depends on the day. And today? She thought of the empty envelope. Today I hope he was watching close. Charles said nothing after that. By the time they reached Annie's building, dusk had settled over the street. Mrs. Alvarez from 2B sat near the entrance with a grocery bag at her feet, resting before climbing the stairs. She looked Charles over, then turned to Annie. You all right, baby? Yes, ma'am, Annie said. Just helping someone. Mrs. Alvarez's eyes narrowed with concern. Your mama home? I think so. You tell Ruth I'm downstairs if she needs me. I will. Inside the hallway, one light flickered overhead. Charles glanced at the peeling paint, the worn carpet, the mailboxes with bent doors. He did not judge it. That made Annie feel better and worse at the same time. At her apartment door, she stopped with the key in her hand. From inside came the low sound of the television. Ruth liked old game shows while folding towels. The sound was ordinary, safe, almost painful. Charles stood behind her, silent. Annie took one breath, then opened the door. Ruth Carter looked up from the kitchen table, a basket of laundry in front of her. Her face brightened when she saw Annie. Then her eyes moved to Charles. The smile faded. Annie, Ruth said carefully, one hand gripping the back of the chair as she stood. Who is this man? Annie stepped inside, suddenly feeling younger than 18. Mama, she said. I need you not to panic. Ruth looked from Charles's torn coat to Annie's empty hands, then to the brown envelope in her pocket. A mother always knew when joy had been replaced by trouble. What happened? Ruth asked. Annie touched the envelope, now holding only a signed note and the weight of what she had done. I helped somebody, she said, and I think I may have ruined everything. Silence settled across the apartment. The television kept talking in the background. A game show audience applauded somewhere on the screen. The smell of onions and rice still lingered from dinner. On the counter sat a pot covered with a towel to keep the food warm. Ruth looked at Annie first. Not Charles. What do you mean ruined everything? Annie swallowed. The scholarship money is gone. Ruth did not move. Charles lowered his head immediately. Annie took the folded paper from the envelope and placed it on the table. There were men threatening him in an alley. They said he owed money. I paid it. Ruth stared at the paper without touching it. How much? Annie's voice became smaller. 800. The room went still again. Charles stepped forward. Ma'am, this was not her fault. Ruth looked up sharply. No, sir. Right now, I'm talking to my daughter. Charles stopped. Ruth pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. Annie knew that movement. It was what her mother did when her knees hurt or when life hit too hard all at once. Annie, she said quietly, that was your school money. I know. That was rent. I know. That was groceries. Annie nodded, her eyes filling. Ruth pressed a hand to her forehead. Charles looked ready to leave. I told her not to do it, he said. Several times. She wouldn't listen. Ruth finally turned toward him. He stood near the door with the loaf of bread still in his hand. The coat looked too thin for the weather. He had the posture of a man trying not to take up space. What's your name? Ruth asked. Charles Whitman. And you owed these men? Yes, ma'am. Are they dangerous? Charles hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Ruth noticed it too. Annie stepped in quickly. Mama, they left. They signed the paper. They said they won't come back. Ruth picked up the note and read every line. Names, amount, signature, phone number. You made them sign this? Annie nodded. Ruth looked at her daughter for a long moment. You really are my child, she murmured. Annie blinked. You're not mad? Ruth gave a tired laugh. Baby, I didn't say that. The tension broke for half a second. Then Ruth looked at Charles again. When did you last eat something besides bread? Charles seemed surprised by the question. I'm fine. That wasn't my question. He looked down at the loaf in his hand. Yesterday morning. Annie turned immediately. What? He gave an embarrassed shrug. I found this earlier. Ruth closed her eyes for a second. The woman who had just learned her daughter gave away school money stood up and walked to the stove. There's rice, she said. Beans too. Not much meat left. Mama, hush. Ruth lifted the lid from the pot. The money's already gone. Starving him won't bring it back. Charles remained near the door. I shouldn't stay. Ruth placed 3 plates on the counter. You walking back out there tonight? Charles did not answer. Thought so. Annie watched her mother move around the kitchen with practiced motions. Small apartment. Old cabinets. Bills tucked under a magnet on the refrigerator. One light flickering above the sink. Nothing in this place was easy. Still, Ruth was setting a 3rd plate. Charles seemed to notice it too. You don't owe me this, he said quietly. Ruth scooped rice onto the plates. No, she replied, but my daughter already spent $800 on you. At this point, 1 bowl of beans won't kill us. For the first time since Annie met him, Charles looked like he might cry. He turned away before either of them could see it. Annie noticed anyway. The apartment stayed quiet while they ate. Ruth sat at the small kitchen table with one hand wrapped around her coffee mug. Annie pushed rice around her plate more than she actually ate. Across from them, Charles held the spoon carefully, like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to sit at a table without being watched. The television still played softly in the living room. After a few minutes, Ruth broke the silence. So where are you staying? Charles lowered the spoon. Different places. That means nowhere. He gave a small nod. Ruth looked at Annie. Annie already knew that look. It was the same look Ruth had worn when neighbors lost jobs, when Mrs. Alvarez's husband got sick, when church families needed groceries. The look that said trouble was already in the house, so pretending otherwise would not help. Mama, Ruth ignored her. You got family? She asked Charles. A pause. No. The answer came too fast. Annie noticed. So did Ruth. You got anybody looking for you? Charles looked down at his plate. Not that I know of. That answer sounded slower. Ruth leaned back in her chair. You mind me asking what happened? Charles turned the spoon in his hand once. I made mistakes, he said quietly. What kind? The kind you don't notice until everything is gone. The room became still again. Annie watched him. He never said he lost a job. Never said divorce. Never said eviction. Just everything. Ruth did not push. People over 40 learned something younger people often missed. Sometimes pain answered when questions did not. She stood slowly from the chair. You taking a shower tonight? Charles looked up, surprised. You smell like outside, Ruth said simply. Bathrooms down the hall. Annie almost smiled. Ruth disappeared into her bedroom and came back carrying an old folded sweatshirt and sweatpants. These belong to my brother, she said. Try them. Charles stared at the clothes. You don't have to. They're clean, Ruth replied. That's all I'm offering. He accepted them with both hands. Thank you. After he disappeared into the bathroom, Annie lowered her voice. Mama, you really okay with this? Ruth sat again. No. Annie blinked. I'm okay with helping him, Ruth said. I'm not okay with what you did. The words landed softly but harder than anger. Annie looked down. You gave away school money. I know. You gave away rent. I know. You gave away food. Annie nodded again. Ruth sighed. Baby. Mercy matters. But mercy without thinking can break people too. Annie's eyes burned. He was sitting there alone. I know. They were surrounding him. I know. He looked. Annie stopped. Broken. She could not say it. Ruth reached across the table and touched her hand. You saw somebody hurting and you moved. That part I'm proud of. She squeezed Annie's fingers. But next time, call me before you save the world. Annie laughed through the tears that had started anyway. A few minutes later, the bathroom door opened. Charles stepped out wearing the oversized sweatshirt. His hair was wet and combed back with water. Cleaned up, he looked different. Not richer, not important. Just educated somehow. The way he stood, the way he thanked Ruth again, the way he automatically folded the towel before handing it back. Ruth noticed too. You military? She asked. Charles blinked. No. Teacher? No. Office job? He hesitated. Something like that. Ruth gave him a look that said she did not believe him. A knock interrupted them. 3 soft taps. Mrs. Alvarez. Ruth opened the door. The older woman stood outside holding a small covered bowl. Made extra soup, she said. Thought maybe y'all needed it. Her eyes moved past Ruth and landed on Charles sitting at the table. Mrs. Alvarez paused. Nobody spoke. Then she handed over the bowl. Tell your guest welcome, she said quietly. Ruth smiled. Thank you. When the door closed, Annie stared. She knew? Ruth set the soup down. Neighbors always know. Charles looked at the bowl for a long moment. People here help each other. Ruth sat back down. Sometimes, she smiled faintly. Poor folks don't always got money, but we got casseroles. That earned the smallest laugh from Annie. Charles smiled too. It disappeared quickly. His eyes had drifted to the refrigerator, specifically to the stack of envelopes held by a magnet. Electric bill, rent notice, past due reminder. He looked away immediately. Annie saw it. So did Ruth. Charles stood. I should leave. Annie frowned. What? You've done enough. It's dark outside, Ruth said. I'll manage. No, you won't, Ruth answered. He looked uncomfortable. I can sleep at a shelter. Where? Silence. Ruth nodded once like she expected that answer. Then she pointed toward the old couch in the living room. You sleep there tonight. Charles looked stunned. I can't. Yes, you can. No, ma'am, I really can't ask that. You didn't. He stood still. Ruth folded a dish towel and placed it on the counter. Listen to me, Mr. Whitman. Her voice softened. My daughter already gave away $800 today. If I send you back outside now, she'll spend the rest of her life wondering if she saved you or abandoned you. Charles lowered his eyes. And I'm too tired to raise a guilty child, Ruth added. Annie smiled despite herself. Charles looked toward the couch. It was old, brown. One arm sagged lower than the other. The blanket folded on the back had been washed so many times the fabric looked thin. He swallowed. I don't remember the last time somebody offered me a couch. Ruth turned off the stove light. Then tonight, you remember? Later, when the apartment lights were off, Annie stood quietly in the kitchen drinking water. Through the doorway, she could see Charles asleep on the couch. One hand still rested near the folded paper from the debt agreement sitting on the coffee table, like he was afraid it might disappear. Annie looked at the empty scholarship envelope beside it. Tomorrow was waiting. Rent, school, bills, question. She should have felt regret. Instead, she felt something worse. Responsibility. Behind her, Ruth's voice came quietly from the hallway. You still awake? Annie nodded. Ruth stood beside her. Baby, she said softly. Sometimes helping somebody costs more than money. Annie looked toward the living room. What if I made a mistake? Ruth followed her eyes. Then we carry it together. Annie woke before sunrise. For a few seconds she forgot. Then she saw the empty scholarship envelope on the kitchen counter beside the sugar jar. Everything came back. The alley. The debt paper. $800. Charles sleeping on their couch. She sat up slowly. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of old pipes inside the walls. Ruth was already awake. Annie could hear her moving around the kitchen. When Annie stepped out, her mother stood at the stove making grits. You sleep at all? Ruth asked without turning. A little. That's more than me. Annie sat at the table. The debt agreement still lay folded near the television. The couch blanket had been neatly folded too. Charles was gone. Annie stood immediately. Mama? Ruth looked over. Bathroom. The door opened a second later. Charles stepped out wearing the same borrowed sweatshirt. His hair was still damp from washing again. He looked uncomfortable seeing Annie stare at him. Morning, he said. Annie sat back down. You scared me. Sorry. Ruth placed bowls on the table. Sit down, Mr. Whitman. I don't want to take more food. Ruth gave him a look. He sat. Breakfast was simple. Grits, toast, and one scrambled egg split between plates. Nobody mentioned the missing scholarship money. Not at first. Halfway through breakfast, Ruth pushed an envelope toward Annie. What's this? Rent reminder. Annie looked at the date. 3 days. Her stomach dropped. Ruth kept eating. We'll figure it out. How? Ruth smiled without humor. That's tomorrow's panic. Charles quietly lowered his spoon. After breakfast, he stood and reached for the dishes. Ruth frowned. You don't gotta do that. I know. He washed every plate anyway. Annie leaned against the counter watching him. He moved differently than most men she knew. Careful, efficient. He rinsed dishes before placing them down. Wiped the sink after finishing. Not rich. Not poor either. Just trained. You ever work in a restaurant? Annie asked. He almost smiled. No. You clean dishes like you have. I used to manage people. The answer slipped out before he could stop it. Annie looked up. What kind of people? Charles dried his hands slowly. Employees. How many? He hesitated. A lot. Ruth noticed it too. Before either woman could ask more, a knock sounded at the door. 3 hard knocks. Everyone froze. Charles looked up immediately. Not nervous. Alert. Ruth noticed that. Annie opened the door. Mr. Hanley stood outside holding a clipboard under one arm. The landlord. Morning had officially become terrible. Morning, Miss Carter. Morning. He glanced inside. Your mama home? Ruth stepped forward. Morning, Mr. Hanley. The older man removed his cap. Hate doing this, Ruth, but office wants reminders out early this month. He handed over a paper. Past due balance. Rent due in 3 days. Annie looked away. Mr. Hanley lowered his voice. You know I've given extensions before. Ruth nodded. I know, but management's breathing down my neck now. Ruth forced a smile. We'll get it handled. He nodded politely and left. The apartment stayed quiet after the door shut. Charles stared at the paper in Ruth's hand. How much? He asked. Ruth folded it immediately. Not your problem. How much? Annie answered before Ruth could stop her. 720. Charles looked down. Almost the same amount. The room suddenly felt smaller. I should leave, he said. Ruth sighed. Here we go again. I mean it. Annie crossed her arms. And go where? Anywhere. You got anywhere? Silence. Charles picked up the folded sweatshirt from the couch. I've already taken enough. Ruth leaned against the counter. Mr. Whitman, can you work? He looked up. What? Can you work? He frowned. Yes. You got identification? A pause. No. References? Another pause. No. Skills? Charles looked like nobody had asked him that question in a long time. Yes. What skills? He answered without thinking. Finance, management, negotiation, operations, logistics. The apartment went quiet. Ruth blinked. Annie slowly lowered her arms. Annie started. That's not normal homeless people answers. Charles realized it too late. He looked away. Ruth saved him. There's a diner near the church, she said. Owner sometimes hires cash work. Washing dishes, cleaning. Charles stared at her. You'd do that? Ruth shrugged. Work is work. Annie smiled faintly. You already wash dishes like a professional. He looked embarrassed. I don't know if they'll take me. They might, Ruth said. People around here still believe in second chances. Charles stood quietly near the couch. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then he said something so softly Annie almost missed it. I used to think work was titles. Ruth folded laundry while listening. It's not? He looked at his hands. No. The answer sounded like experience. Later that morning, Annie got ready for school paperwork. She packed her bag slowly. The envelope felt lighter now. Not physically, emotionally. Charles stood near the window watching the street. You going back to school today? Financial office. For the scholarship? She nodded. His shoulders tightened. I'll fix this. Annie laughed softly. With what? He turned. I don't know yet. She looked at him. For the first time since meeting him, she saw something under the exhaustion. Not pride. Responsibility. The same thing keeping her awake at night. Before leaving, Annie grabbed the debt paper from the table and slipped it into her backpack. Charles noticed. You kept it? Of course. Why? She zipped the bag closed. Because poor people keep receipts. He looked at her for a long moment. Ruth called from the kitchen. Annie bus in 10 minutes. I know. She headed for the door. Behind her, Charles spoke quietly. Miss Carter. She turned. Thank you. Annie looked at the apartment. The unpaid rent notice. The old couch. Her mother folding towels that should have been replaced years ago. Then she looked back at him. You can thank me after you get a job. For the first time, Charles smiled. It stayed there a little longer this time. After Annie left, Ruth watched him from the kitchen. You really managed people? Charles stared out the window. Yes. How many? He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. Enough that I forgot how to see them. Ruth stopped folding. Charles looked at the church across the street, then at the rent notice still lying on the table. And for the first time since entering their home, shame looked heavier on him than hunger. Annie reached Fulton Community College just before 9. Students crossed the courtyard with coffee cups and backpacks slung over one shoulder. Conversations floated through the air. Midterms. Weekend plans. Rent splits. Somebody complained about parking fees. Normal problems. Annie held her backpack tighter. Inside was the debt paper with Charles Whitman's name on it and an envelope that no longer held a future. The financial aid office sat at the end of the hallway, the same office where yesterday she had walked out smiling. Today she stood outside the door trying to slow her breathing. Miss Carter? Annie looked up. Mrs. Jensen from financial aid recognized her immediately. You back already? Annie forced a smile. Yes, ma'am. The woman motioned her inside. What can I help you with? Annie sought. The office smelled like printer ink and coffee. The scholarship certificate still sat on the corner of Mrs. Jensen's desk. Annie could not look at it. I need to ask something, she said quietly. If scholarship money gets used for something unexpected, what happens? Mrs. Jensen paused. What kind of unexpected? Annie looked down. Family emergency? The woman relaxed slightly. Depends on documentation. Annie nodded. Documentation. She almost laughed. All she had was a debt agreement signed in an alley. Mrs. Jensen typed something. Miss Carter, this scholarship was meant for educational costs. Books, transportation, housing support connected to school. You understand? Yes, ma'am. You're a good student. Don't make panic decisions. Too late. Annie thanked her and left. Outside, the hallway felt louder. Her phone buzzed. Mama. Annie answered immediately. You okay? Ruth sounded tired. I'm fine. Mr. Whitman left. Annie stopped walking. What? He said he was looking for work. When? Half hour ago. Annie turned toward the exit. Did he eat first? Yes. Did he say where? No. Annie closed her eyes. Of course he did. The man carried guilt like luggage. Back at the apartment, Charles had left the folded blanket exactly where he found it. He had also washed the breakfast dishes again. Ruth looked at the clean sink and sighed. You didn't have to do all this, she had told him. I know. He stood by the door afterward, holding the borrowed sweatshirt sleeves awkwardly. There's a diner near St. Luke's Church, Ruth said. Owner's name is Earl. Tell him Ruth Carter sent you. Charles nodded. Thank you. You keep saying that. Because I keep owing it. Ruth handed him a paper bag. Inside sat 2 pieces of toast wrapped in napkins. Charles stared at it. I can't take your food. You can if you want another lecture. He accepted it. Before leaving, he paused near the couch. His eyes landed briefly on the rent notice still sitting on the table. Then he walked out. Now, nearly 3 hours later, he stood outside St. Luke's Church looking at the diner across the street. Earl's Place. Small brick building, hand-painted sign, 2 pickup trucks parked outside. Charles pushed open the door. A bell rang overhead. The smell of bacon and coffee hit immediately. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man in his 60s wiping glasses. You eating or working? Charles blinked. What? The man shrugged. Most folks come for one or the other. Charles almost smiled. Working. Experience? A little. Earl looked him over. Torn shoes. Borrowed clothes. Tired eyes. Dish pit out back, Earl said. Can you wash? Yes. Can you show up tomorrow? Yes. Then you got work. Charles stood still. Just like that. No resume. No questions. No judgment. Earl pointed toward the kitchen. Pays cash. Not much. Lunch included. Charles nodded slowly. Thank you. Earl snorted. Thank Ruth Carter. That woman's kept half this neighborhood standing. Charles looked toward the church windows across the street. Maybe she had. Back at school, Annie walked out into the courtyard. Madison Clark sat near the fountain with 2 girls from business class. Her eyes landed on Annie immediately. Hey, scholarship girl. Annie kept walking. Madison stood. Heard you got funding approved. Annie stopped. Congratulations. The smile did not reach Madison's eyes. One of the girls beside her laughed softly. Wish I got free money. Annie knew that tone. She had heard versions of it since middle school. Free money, as if scholarships erased working nights, sick mothers, empty refrigerators. Annie kept her voice calm. It wasn't free. Madison crossed her arms. Whatever you say. Annie walked away before anger answered for her. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered. Silence. Hello? Nothing. Then the call ended. Annie frowned. A second later, another message came. Unknown. You got a big heart. Hope your friend still remembers you. Her stomach dropped. The alley. Vince. She called immediately. No answer. The number disappeared when she tried again. Annie stood still in the middle of campus. Something cold moved through her chest. At that same moment, Charles stepped out of Earl's diner. Across the street, a dark sedan sat parked near the church. Engine running. Windows tinted. He stopped walking. The car had been there earlier. It was still there. Charles looked away immediately and kept moving. Inside the sedan, a man lowered his phone. Found him, he said quietly. The driver looked up. You sure? The man watched Charles disappear down the sidewalk. Yes. He picked up another phone. Tell her, he said. He's alive. Annie stared at the message again. You got a big heart. Hope your friend still remembers you. Her thumb hovered over the screen. No number now. No call history. Just the feeling that somebody had looked through a window she did not know existed. Annie? She looked up. Professor Daniels stood outside the classroom holding attendance sheets. You coming in? Annie forced the phone into her bag. Yes, sir. She sat through the next hour without hearing half the lecture. Her eyes kept drifting toward the window. Who sent it? Vince? One of the men from the alley? Or someone else entirely? Back across town, Charles walked slowly toward the apartment building. He carried a folded napkin from Earl's diner in one pocket. Earl had given him a sandwich after the short shift. Lunch tomorrow, too, Earl had said. Show up at 6. Charles still had trouble believing it. He passed St. Luke's Church again. The dark setting was gone. He kept walking anyway. Inside the apartment, Ruth sat at the kitchen table sorting bills. Electric, rent, Water. The stack looked smaller every month and heavier every week. Charles stopped at the doorway. You all right? Ruth smiled without looking up. That depends who's asking. He sat carefully across from her. Rent's due in 3 days. She glanced up. You saw that? Yes. Ruth folded another paper. Nothing new. Charles looked at the numbers. 720. A strange amount. Not enough to destroy someone. Just enough to keep them tired. I got work. Ruth stopped moving. At the diner? He nodded. When? Tomorrow morning. Ruth smiled. Well, look at that. He looked down at his hands. It won't help much. Money always helps. No. He shook his head slightly. Not the way you think. Ruth watched him quietly. You talk like somebody who used to have too much of it. The room became still. Charles did not answer immediately. I used to think money fixed things, he said at last. And? It only hides what's broken. Ruth leaned back. That sounds expensive. A knock interrupted them. 3 fast taps. Mrs. Alvarez. Ruth opened the door. The older woman stepped inside holding a casserole dish. Church leftovers, she announced. Then she saw Charles. Again. You still here? Charles stood awkwardly. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Alvarez handed the dish to Ruth. Good. She looked at Charles. You got a job yet? Ruth smiled. He does now. Mrs. Alvarez nodded once. Then keep him. Charles blinked. The woman shrugged. Neighborhood needs men who wash dishes and say thank you. She left before anyone answered. Ruth laughed under her breath. Charles did not. He looked shaken. At school, Annie walked toward the bus stop after class. Madison and the other girls passed by. One of them whispered something. The others laughed. Annie ignored it. Her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. This time it was a photo. She opened it. Charles. Walking out of Earl's diner. Taken from across the street. Her blood ran cold. Another message appeared. He's safe. Annie stopped moving. Whoever this was knew where Charles had gone. Knew he was at the diner. Knew Annie cared. She called immediately. The number disconnected. Miss Carter? Annie turned. Mrs. Jensen from financial aid stood near the steps. You forgot these. She held out Annie's scholarship forms. Annie had left them in the office. Thank you. Mrs. Jensen studied her face. You okay? Annie forced a smile. Yes, ma'am. The woman hesitated. Good students carry too much sometimes. Annie held the papers tighter. If only that was all it was. That evening she hurried home. The apartment door was open. Inside, Charles stood near the sink washing vegetables while Ruth cut onions. The sight stopped Annie. Normal. Too normal. Charles looked up first. You're home. Annie walked in slowly. Ruth noticed her expression. What happened? Annie pulled out the phone and showed them the photo. The kitchen went silent. Charles took the phone. His face changed. Not fear. Recognition. Ruth noticed immediately. You know something. Charles lowered the phone. No. That wasn't a no face, Ruth said. He looked toward the window. Annie stepped closer. Who's looking for you? Charles stayed quiet. Mr. Whitman. He closed his eyes. My sister. The answer surprised both women. You have family? Annie asked. Yes. Then why did you tell Mama you had nobody? Charles sat down slowly. Because she doesn't know where I am. Ruth folded her arms. And that's bad? No. Then what is it? He looked at the photo again. She'll come. The apartment grew quiet. Annie waited. Charles held the phone in both hands. And when she does, he said softly, everything changes. The apartment stayed quiet after Charles spoke. Ruth turned off the stove burner. Annie stood near the table with the phone still in her hand. She'll come, Annie repeated. Then what changes? Charles looked down at the photo again. Everything I tried to leave behind. Ruth pulled out a chair. Sit. He hesitated. That wasn't a request, Ruth said. Charles sat. Annie took the chair across from him. You have a sister, she said. You told us you had nobody. I told you what was true at the time. That doesn't even make sense. He rubbed his forehead. My sister and I haven't spoken in months. Because? Charles looked toward the window. Because she wanted me to fight. And you didn't? I couldn't. Ruth folded her arms. You hiding from family or running from something? Charles gave a tired smile. Both. The answer did not help. Annie sat back. Who took that picture? I don't know. You recognize something? Charles nodded once. The car. Ruth noticed immediately. What car? The dark sedan outside St. Luke's. Annie froze. You saw them? Yes. When? This morning. Annie looked down at the photo again. Someone had been following him before she even received the message. Ruth sighed. Wonderful. Homeless man with mystery followers. Exactly what every mother wants in her apartment. Annie almost smiled. Charles did not. I should leave tonight. No, Annie answered immediately. Both adults looked at her. You leave now, and whoever took that photo follows you again. Ruth nodded slowly. She's right. Charles looked genuinely surprised. You still want me here? Ruth pointed toward the dishes in the sink. You cooked. You got a job. You fold blankets. She shrugged. I've housed worse relatives. That finally earned a small laugh from Annie. Charles lowered his eyes. Thank you. Ruth stood. You can thank me by peeling potatoes. He blinked. What? Dinner doesn't cook itself. A few minutes later, they stood side by side in the kitchen. Annie watched from the table. Charles peeled slowly but neatly. You do that like you've done it before, Ruth said. I haven't. Liar. He looked up. Ruth smiled faintly. Your peels are too clean. Annie laughed. Charles shook his head. I had staff. The room quieted. He had said it without thinking. Ruth stopped cutting. What kind of staff? He kept peeling. Office staff. What office? Charles placed the potato down. A company. What company? He looked at the knife in his hand. One that doesn't matter anymore. Ruth let it go. People over 40 knew when someone hit a wall. A knock sounded. Everyone looked up. 2 quick taps. Mrs. Alvarez again. This time she held a folded newspaper. Thought y'all should see this. Ruth took it. Front page business section. Missing executive rumors continue around Whitman Holdings. Annie looked up immediately. Charles had already gone still. The article showed a building downtown. Glass. Steel. Corporate logo. Whitman Holdings. Annie slowly turned toward him. The last name. Whitman. Charles stood up too quickly. The chair scraped the floor. Ruth stared at the newspaper. Mrs. Alvarez looked between them. What? She asked. Nobody answered. Charles grabbed the dish towel from the counter. That's not me. Too fast. Too defensive. Annie picked up the paper. The article was short. CEO Charles Whitman missing for months, following financial collapse and internal dispute. Her eyes stopped. Charles Whitman. The room went silent. Mrs. Alvarez blinked twice. Ruth lowered the newspaper. Charles looked trapped. Annie stared at him. You said you managed people. He did not answer. You said you had staff. Silence. You said you lost everything. His shoulders dropped. Mrs. Alvarez sat down without asking. Well, she muttered. This got interesting. Ruth folded the newspaper carefully. Mr. Whitman. He looked up. Is that you? Charles closed his eyes. Nobody moved. Then very quietly, yes. The word hit the apartment harder than shouting. Annie looked at him. The torn shoes. The old coat. The man eating bread in an alley. The man she spent her scholarship money to save. A CEO. A missing executive. Maybe more. Mrs. Alvarez crossed herself. Ruth sat back down slowly. Annie did not speak. Charles looked at her. I wanted to tell you. When? He had no answer. The room stayed silent until headlights flashed across the apartment window. Everyone turned. A black SUV had stopped outside the building. Then another. Car doors opened. Ruth stood. Mrs. Alvarez whispered, Lord have mercy. Charles went pale. A woman stepped out of the first SUV. Mid-40s. Dark coat. Sharp posture. She looked up directly at the apartment window. Charles whispered one word. Emily. Nobody moved. The black SUVs sat outside the apartment building with their engines running. The woman on the sidewalk had not taken her eyes off the second-floor window. Charles looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Emily, he said again, quieter this time. Annie looked from the window back to him. Your sister? He nodded. Mrs. Alvarez stood up immediately. I'm going downstairs. Ruth caught her arm. No, you're not. I absolutely am. I need to see this. Ruth sighed. Fine. But if anything happens, you yell. Mrs. Alvarez nodded and hurried out. Annie turned back to Charles. She found you. He stared at the floor. I told you she would. A car door slammed below. Footsteps. Then another. Ruth crossed her arms. How many people your sister bring? Charles looked uncomfortable. Too many. A knock came at the door. Not loud. 3 controlled taps. Nobody spoke. Ruth walked over and opened it halfway. The woman from downstairs stood there. Mid-40s. White coat. Hair pinned back neatly, despite the wind outside. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit holding a leather folder. The woman saw Charles immediately. Her face broke. "Charlie." The room went silent. Charles stood frozen near the kitchen. She stepped inside before anyone invited her. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she crossed the room and hugged him. Charles did not react right away. His arms stayed at his sides. The woman pulled back, tears already in her eyes. "You idiot," she whispered. "Do you know how long we've been looking for you?" Charles looked down. "I know." "No, you don't." Her voice shook. "I searched shelters, hospitals, police reports, morgues." Annie looked away. The man with the folder stepped inside quietly and closed the door. Ruth immediately noticed him. "And you are?" "Daniel Mercer," he said politely, "family attorney." Mrs. Alvarez appeared behind them carrying a folding chair she had somehow acquired. Nobody asked where it came from. She sat near the wall. "I'm staying," she announced. No one argued. Emily finally looked around the apartment. Her eyes landed on Ruth, then Annie, then the dishes in the sink. The folded blanket on the couch. Understanding crossed her face. "You helped him." Ruth shrugged. "He needed dinner." Emily looked at Annie. "You're the girl from the report." Annie blinked. "What report?" Daniel opened the folder. "A witness statement." He paused. "About the debt collectors." The apartment grew still. Charles looked up sharply. "What?" Emily sat down. "We found the men." Annie felt her stomach tighten. "Vince." "Their statements matched," Daniel said. "Young black female, college student, paid $800 on behalf of unidentified male." Emily looked at Annie again. "You spent your scholarship money." It was not a question. Annie suddenly felt embarrassed. Charles looked like someone had hit him. Emily turned slowly toward her brother. "She gave away school money." Charles said nothing. "She paid your debt while you sat in an alley eating bread." Still nothing. Ruth stepped in. "That's enough." Emily looked at her. "My daughter made her choice," Ruth said. "Don't make her regret it." Emily lowered her eyes immediately. "You're right. I'm sorry." The room settled. Daniel opened the folder again. "We need to leave tonight." Charles looked up. "No." Emily stared at him. "What?" "I'm not leaving." Silence. "Charlie." "No." His voice was calm, the first firm thing Annie had heard from him. Emily stood. "You don't understand what happened after you disappeared." "I understand enough." "No, you don't." She looked at Daniel. "Show him." The attorney handed over several documents. Charles read the first page. His face changed. Then the second. The third. Annie could not see the words, but she saw his hands tighten. "What is it?" Ruth asked. Emily answered. "Your brother." The room quieted. Charles closed the folder. "My brother?" Emily nodded. "He moved everything while you were gone." "What do you mean everything?" "The board." Her voice hardened. "Accounts. Properties. Voting rights." Charles looked up slowly. Daniel added quietly. "He positioned you as unstable." Nobody spoke. Emily took a breath. The story was simple. Financial collapse. Stress. Breakdown. She looked at him. "Then you vanished." Charles sat very still. Annie suddenly understood the muttering in the alley. Trusted the wrong man. Ruth leaned against the table. "Family did this?" Emily laughed once without humor. "Families do worse." Charles closed the folder. "You have proof?" Daniel nodded immediately. "Enough to fight." "Fight what?" "Everything." Silence. Outside, another SUV pulled away. The apartment seemed smaller now. Poor walls. Old couch. Past due bills. And in the middle of it sat a man who apparently used to run companies. Annie still could not make the pieces fit. Charles looked at her, then at the rent notice on the refrigerator, then at the debt papers still folded on the table. Emily followed his eyes. "What is that?" Annie reached for it too late. Emily unfolded the paper. Debt settlement receipt and agreement. Charles Whitman. Amount owed. $800. She read every line. Her hands shook. "This is real?" Nobody answered. Emily looked at Annie. "You paid this?" Annie nodded. Emily sat down slowly. "My God." Charles lowered his head. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Emily looked at Ruth. "Mrs. Carter." "Ruth." "Ruth." Emily swallowed. My brother owes your family more than money. Ruth looked toward the kitchen. The rent says otherwise. For the first time since arriving, Daniel smiled. Emily did not. She looked at Charles. We leave tomorrow morning. Charles stared at the debt paper. No. Emily blinked. I said no. Charlie, I have work tomorrow. The apartment went silent again. Mrs. Alvarez leaned forward in her folding chair. Oh, this just got better. The apartment stayed quiet after Charles spoke. I have work tomorrow. Emily stared at him as if she had misheard. Work? At Earl's Diner. Mrs. Alvarez sat up straighter in her folding chair. Dishwashing. Emily slowly turned toward Ruth. Ruth nodded once. He starts at 6. The woman looked back at her brother. You used to run a corporation. Charles folded the debt paper and placed it back on the table. And tomorrow I wash dishes. Daniel cleared his throat. Mr. Whitman, with respect. That's not the issue. No, Charles said quietly. The issue is I disappeared. Emily stepped closer. You disappeared because Daniel and I told you to hide. The room went still. Annie looked up. Ruth stopped moving. Charles looked at his sister. You told me to leave for a few days. You were being watched. You told me to rest. You were collapsing. He laughed once without humor. And while I rested, my brother took everything. Emily's face tightened. We didn't know he'd move that fast. Charles looked away. Mrs. Alvarez muttered, Never trust family with paperwork. Nobody disagreed. Daniel opened the folder again. We have evidence now. Internal transfers. Forged authorizations. Board communications. We can reverse this. Charles stayed silent. Emily lowered her voice. Charlie, listen to me. You don't belong here. The words landed badly. Annie felt it immediately. Ruth did too. Charles looked around the apartment. The old couch. The worn carpet. The rent notice. The folded blanket. Then he looked back at his sister. Here? Emily realized it too late. That's not what I meant. No? She swallowed. I mean, this isn't your life. Charles leaned back in the chair. No. He glanced toward Ruth. It's theirs. Silence. And somehow they handled it better than I handled mine. Nobody spoke. Ruth finally broke the tension. Mr. Whitman, if you want to fight your brother, fight him. But don't insult my apartment while doing it. Emily turned immediately. I'm sorry. Ruth nodded. Good. Annie hid a smile. Daniel stepped forward carefully. There's another issue. Charles looked up. Your brother knows you're alive. The room quieted again. Emily nodded. The article yesterday wasn't accidental. What article? The one in the paper. She glanced toward Mrs. Alvarez. The older woman hugged the newspaper closer to her chest. Emily continued. It was bait. Charles stood. He knows? Daniel nodded. We think so. Annie suddenly remembered the text. Hope your friend still remembers you. Her stomach tightened. I got messages, she said. Everyone looked at her. She took out her phone and showed them. Emily read the screen. Daniel's expression changed immediately. Who sent this? I don't know. The attorney looked at Charles. We need to move tonight. No. Emily closed her eyes. Charlie. No. His voice stayed calm. He looked toward Annie. She already paid for my mistakes. Annie blinked. I'm not leaving before I repay them. Ruth laughed softly from the kitchen. You got $720? Charles looked down. No. Then tomorrow you wash dishes. Mrs. Alvarez nodded proudly. That's right. Emily looked like she had stepped into another planet. Her brother, missing executive of Whitman Holdings, was being scheduled for diner work by a woman with overdue bills. Daniel rubbed his forehead. We have a legal meeting at 9 tomorrow. Charles shook his head. I work until 11. Emily stared. Charlie, I gave Earl my word. The apartment went silent again. Annie looked at him. The man in the alley had asked for more time. The man in her kitchen refused to break promises. The difference sat heavily in her chest. A knock interrupted them. Everyone froze. Not 3 taps this time. 1 hard knock. Then another. Ruth looked toward the door. Nobody moved. The knock came again. Mr. Hanley's voice followed. Ruth? You home? The rent notice. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. I got it. She opened the door. Mr. Hanley stood outside holding another paper. Sorry this late. He looked inside and froze. 2 SUVs outside. A lawyer. A well-dressed woman. Charles. Mrs. Alvarez with a folding chair. He blinked twice. Ruth smiled tiredly. Long story. He handed over the paper. Office updated the notice. Ruth unfolded it. The balance had changed. Late fee added. $800. The room went still. Anya started. The same amount. Charles looked at the paper, then at Annie. Nobody said anything. Mr. Hanley noticed the silence. Everything okay? Ruth folded the notice slowly. We're fine. He nodded awkwardly and left. The door closed. Ruth placed the paper beside the debt agreement. 2 papers. Same amount. $800. Charles stared at them. Then quietly, I owe you twice now. Annie tried to joke. You keeping count? No. He looked at the rent notice. I just started. Emily watched her brother's face. For the first time since finding him, she stopped arguing. Because she finally understood. He was not staying because he had nowhere else to go. He was staying because leaving now would feel like running again. Outside, one of the SUVs drove away. Inside, Ruth picked up the empty plates. Enough drama, she said. Everybody eating leftovers. Mrs. Alvarez raised her hand immediately. I support this motion. Even Annie laughed. Only Charles didn't. He was still looking at the rent notice. $800. The exact amount Annie had spent saving him. The apartment quieted after dinner. Mrs. Alvarez finally went downstairs carrying her folding chair and the newspaper tucked under one arm. Emily and Daniel stayed. The SUVs remained outside. Ruth washed dishes. Annie sat at the table pretending to study while Charles stared at the rent notice beside the debt paper. $800. The same number again. You keep looking at it, Annie said. Charles did not move. I know. You planning to magically pay it? Emily looked up immediately. Actually, we can. Everyone turned. She reached into her purse. No. Charles said it before she even pulled anything out. Emily froze. Charlie. No. Ruth turned off the faucet. Hold on now. Nobody said no to money yet. Emily almost smiled. It's not charity. She looked at Annie. It's repayment. Charles stood. No. Daniel stepped in carefully. Mr. Whitman, legally. I said no. His voice stayed calm. That somehow made it stronger. Annie looked up from the table. Why? Charles finally looked at her. Because she paid believing I was nobody. Silence. She helped a man in an alley. He glanced at Emily's purse. Not a corporation. Ruth dried her hands slowly. Well, she said. That's stubborn. Mrs. Alvarez's casserole dish still sat on the counter. The clock ticked. Emily lowered her purse. You always do this. Charles looked away. Do what? Punish yourself. Nobody spoke. She stepped closer. You lost everything and still think suffering is noble. That isn't what this is. No? Her voice broke slightly. Then what is it? Charles looked around the apartment. The couch, the worn table, the stack of unpaid bills. Then Annie. She gave away her future for me. Annie opened her mouth. He continued. I don't get to walk back into money tomorrow and act like it never happened. The room went quiet again. Ruth sat down. Mr. Whitman. He looked at her. You know what pride and rent got in common? He blinked. Neither one pays bills. Even Emily laughed softly. Charles almost smiled. Almost. Later that night, Daniel spread documents across the table. Financial records, transfer statements, board votes. Annie tried not to look but failed. Numbers covered every page. Million. Properties. Accounts. Companies. Her head spun. She looked at Charles. The man who had eaten bread in an alley had once signed papers worth more money than Annie could imagine. Your brother moved assets through shell companies, Daniel said. Charles read silently. Using whose approval? Yours. Charles looked up sharply. I never signed these. Daniel slid another page over. Forgery analysis. Emily folded her arms. We have proof. Charles read. His face changed. Annie noticed. What? He handed her the paper. At the bottom sat a name. Andrew Whitman. Brother. Board acting authority. Emergency transfer authorization. Annie looked up. Your brother really did all this? Charles leaned back. Yes. The answer came too quickly. Too certain. Emily noticed too. You already knew. Charles stayed quiet. Daniel looked up from the files. Mr. Whitman? He rubbed his forehead. There were signs. What signs? He stared at the table. Employees leaving. Pause. Contracts moving. Another pause. People avoiding meetings. Emily looked stunned. You knew? I suspected. And said nothing? Charles laughed once. He was my brother. The room went still. Ruth spoke softly. That'll do it. Nobody disagreed. Around 10 o'clock, Annie got up to make tea. Charles stood at the sink rinsing cups. Again, always doing something. You really going to work tomorrow? She asked. Yes. Even with all this? He nodded. You serious? I gave my word. Annie leaned against the counter. Why do I feel like you never broke promises before? He stopped washing. I did. She waited. He looked at the running water. My daughter wanted me home more. The kitchen became still. Annie remembered. I had a daughter once. She died when she was little. He had said it like a fact. Now it sounded like regret. What happened? Annie asked quietly. Charles dried his hands. Cancer. The word landed softly. She was 6. Annie lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. So am I. They stood in silence. In the living room, Emily watched them. Ruth noticed. She reminds him of her? Emily looked over. No. Ruth waited. Emily smiled sadly. She reminds him of who he used to be. Near midnight, everyone settled down. Daniel left for the hotel. Emily took the armchair. Ruth went to bed. The apartment darkened. Annie stood at the kitchen window drinking water. Below, one SUV still remained. Security, protection, wealth, power, all parked outside a building with broken hallway lights. Behind her, Charles folded the couch blanket. You should sleep, he said. So should you. He nodded. Neither moved. Annie looked out the window. You know what's weird? What? I still think of you as the guy with bread. For the first time in days, Charles laughed. Quiet. Real. I think I do too. Annie smiled. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. One photo. A man leaving a downtown office building. Caption underneath. He knows you're back. Charles looked over Annie's shoulder. The smile disappeared. His face went pale. Annie looked at him. Who is he? Charles took the phone slowly. His voice dropped. My brother. The apartment felt smaller after Charles spoke. My brother. Annie looked at the photo again. The man stepping out of the downtown office building looked polished. Dark coat, gray hair at the temples, security walking behind him. Nothing about him looked dangerous. That somehow made it worse. Emily stood up from the armchair. Let me see. Charles handed her the phone. Her face hardened immediately. When was this sent? Just now, Annie said. Emily showed it to Daniel over a video call. The attorney looked tired but alert. Delete nothing, he said immediately. Save every message. Annie nodded. Charles sat back down on the couch. His eyes stayed on the floor. Emily looked at him. He knows. Yes. How? Charles laughed quietly. Andrew always knew everything. Nobody answered. The next morning came too fast. Charles was awake before everyone else. Annie found him in the kitchen wearing Earl's apron folded over one arm. You're still going? Yes. She leaned against the doorway. Your brother knows where you are. Yes. You got lawyers, security, company drama, fake documents. Yes. And you're going to wash dishes. He looked at the apron. I promised. Annie shook her head. You're impossible. A small smile appeared. Ruth walked in carrying her coffee mug. Impossible people usually survive longer. Emily entered next. You're not going alone. Charles sighed. Emily. No. He looked at her. You disappear for months. Get found in an apartment with strangers. And now somebody is tracking your phone activity. I'm coming. Ruth raised her hand. I vote yes. Annie nodded. Sama. Charles looked betrayed. Mrs. Alvarez knocked and entered without waiting. I also vote yes. Nobody asked why she was already there. Half an hour later, Earl's diner had never looked stranger. Charles stood behind the kitchen sink wearing an apron. Emily sat in a booth in designer clothes. Mrs. Alvarez drank coffee like she owned the place. Ruth read coupons. Annie worked on class notes. Earl looked around. What kind of intervention is this? Nobody answered. Work started. Charles washed dishes, stack after stack. Coffee cups, plates, pans. He moved quietly. Earl watched him for a while. You ever done this before? No. You sure? Charles rinsed another plate. No. Earl laughed. At 10:30, a black SUV stopped outside. Every head turned. Emily stood immediately. Charles did not. A man in a suit entered. Mid-50s, clean cut, calm face. He looked directly at Charles. The diner went silent. Mr. Whitman. Charles kept washing dishes. Earl looked confused. You know him? Nobody answered. The man approached slowly. My name is Richard Hale. I represent your brother. Emily stepped forward. You have nerve. Richard ignored her. He placed an envelope on the counter. Mr. Whitman, Andrew would like to resolve this privately. Charles looked at the envelope, did not touch it. Richard continued. There's transportation ready, housing, medical support. Earl muttered. Medical? Richard kept talking. You don't need to stay here. Charles dried his hands, then finally looked up. I know. The man smiled slightly. Good. Charles placed the dish towel down. I'm staying anyway. Silence. Richard's smile disappeared. Mr. Whitman. No. Emily almost smiled. Richard lowered his voice. Your brother wants peace. Charles laughed. The sound was quiet, tired. He took my company. He protected it. He took my name. Richard stayed calm. He preserved the business. Charles stepped closer. And left me eating bread in an alley? The diner went silent. Earl slowly put down the coffee pot. Richard had no answer. Mrs. Alvarez whispered. Get him, Charlie. Ruth elbowed her. Richard adjusted his tie. Andrew regrets how things happened. No. Charles shook his head. He regrets. I survived. Nobody moved. The man looked at him for several seconds. Then he picked up the envelope. You'll hear from us again. He turned and walked out. The SUV drove away. The diner remained quiet. Earl looked at Charles. You got more going on than dishes, huh? Charles picked up another plate. Yes. Earl nodded. Still got lunch rush in 20 minutes. Charles almost smiled. Understood. Annie watched him. The man who had once run companies had just returned to washing dishes without hesitation. Emily sat back down slowly. Her eyes were wet. Ruth noticed. You okay? Emily nodded. No. She looked at Charles. He never used to stop working. Ruth sipped coffee. Good. Emily blinked. Ruth smiled faintly. Means he finally learned who he is without the suit. At noon, Annie's phone buzzed. Another message. This one had no photo. Just words. He won't stay poor for long. She looked up immediately. Across the street, a black sedan sat parked. Engine running. Inside, someone was watching the diner. Annie kept looking at the black sedan across the street. Engine running. Windows dark. Whoever sat inside had not moved. He won't stay poor for long. The message still glowed on her screen. Emily leaned over. Another one? Annie nodded. Charles looked up from the sink. His hands stopped moving. Ruth followed Annie's eyes to the sedan. You know them? Charles stared for a second too long. No. Earl walked over carrying a tray of plates. You got people watching you? Mrs. Alvarez raised her coffee mug. We all got people watching us. Mine just gossip. Nobody laughed. The lunch crowd began to fill the diner. Construction workers, retirees, church volunteers. Life moved. The sedan stayed. Charles returned to washing dishes, plate after plate. Steam rose around him. At one point, Annie noticed him glance toward the street. Only once, then never again. At 2 o'clock, Earl called him over. Take 5. Charles dried his hands. He stepped outside the back door behind the diner. The alley there smelled like coffee grounds and old cardboard. He stood alone for less than 30 seconds. A voice came from behind him. Still hiding? Charles turned. Andrew Whitman stood near the fence. Gray coat, perfect tie, samifatse, different eyes. Charles did not move. You shouldn't be here, he said. Andrew smiled. Neither should you. Inside the diner, Annie looked toward the kitchen. Charles was gone. She stood immediately. Ruth noticed. What? Where's Charles? Emily looked up. The back door swung gently. Open. Outside, the alley stayed quiet. Andrew kept his hands in his coat pockets. You look terrible. Charles said nothing. Andrew looked at the diner. This where you work now? Still nothing. Andrew smiled faintly. You know, when you disappeared, people thought you died. You hoped I did. Andrew's smile vanished. No. Charles laughed quietly. You took everything before they finished searching. Andrew stepped closer. I protected the company. You stole it. I saved it. The words hit hard. Charles looked at him. You forged signatures. You stopped leading. You lied. You vanished. The alley went silent. Andrew lowered his voice. You left me no choice. Charles shook his head. You always had a choice. Inside, Annie stepped through the back door. She stopped. Andrew turned first. His eyes moved over her. Young, black, college backpack, cheap shoes. Recognition came immediately. You. Annie stood straighter. Charles moved slightly in front of her without thinking. Andrew noticed. So this is the girl. Emily appeared behind Annie. The moment she saw Andrew, her face changed. What are you doing here? Andrew smiled again. Checking on family. You lost that right. He ignored her. His eyes stayed on Charles. She paid your debt? Nobody answered. Andrew nodded slowly. Interesting. Annie stepped forward. What does that mean? He finally looked at her directly. It means my brother spent his life helping powerful people. Pause. Nice to see somebody finally helped him. The words should have sounded kind. They did not. Charles spoke quietly. Leave. Andrew looked at him. You coming back? No. Think carefully. Charles did not answer. Andrew adjusted his coat. The board meets Friday. Emily stiffened. Andrew continued. If you're not there. He looked at Charles. Everything becomes permanent. He walked away. A black sedan pulled from across the street and stopped for him. The same car. The door opened. Andrew got in. Then it drove away. Nobody moved. Earl stuck his head out the back door. Everything okay? Ruth answered first. No. He nodded. Lunch rush in 5. Then disappeared again. Mrs. Alvarez appeared next. Nobody knew how she moved so fast. She looked down the alley. That him? Emily nodded. Mrs. Alvarez crossed her arms. I don't like his face. Back inside the diner, Charles sat alone at a corner table. Annie sat across from him. You okay? He looked at his hands. No. She waited. He finally spoke. When my daughter got sick, he stopped. Andrew handled work while I stayed at the hospital. Annie listened. I trusted him. Emily stood nearby. We all did. Charles looked out the window. She died. Silence. Then I buried myself in work. He laughed quietly. And he buried me in paperwork. Annie looked down. Outside, the black sedan was gone. Inside the diner, people laughed over coffee. Normal lives. Normal afternoons. Charles stood. I'm going Friday. Emily looked up sharply. The board meeting? He nodded. Daniel had just walked through the front door. You sure? Charles looked at the apron in his hands. Then at Annie. Then at Ruth. I owe people. Ruth nodded slowly. About time. Annie smiled faintly. Mrs. Alvarez raised her mug. Go get your company back. Dishwashing billionaire. For the first time since the alley, Charles smiled without sadness. Then Annie's phone vibrated again. New message. Friday won't end the way he thinks. Attached was a photo. Ruth's apartment building. Taken that morning. The photo stayed on Annie's screen. Ruth's apartment building. Taken from across the street. Morning light. Mrs. Alvarez's chair near the entrance. Someone had been there. Emily took the phone first. Her face hardened. When was this sent? Just now. Daniel stepped closer. Forward it to me. Annie did. Charles had not moved. He stared at the image, as if it hurt more than the alley ever had. Ruth folded her arms. So now somebody's watching my building, too. Nobody answered. Earl looked up from behind the counter. You folks bringing danger into my diner? Mrs. Alvarez raised a finger. Technically, the danger arrived in a suit. Nobody argued. Daniel checked his phone. The sender used a masked route again. Emily looked at Charles. We leave tonight. No. This time his answer came faster. Emily closed her eyes. Charlie. No. He looked at Ruth. This started with me. Ruth nodded. Yes. And now they're watching your home. Yes. I should go. Ruth shook her head. No. Everyone turned. She wiped her hands on a dish towel. You leaving won't stop people watching. Charles stared at her. You don't know that. I know enough. She pointed toward the photo. Somebody took a picture of my building. That means they already know where we live. Pause. Running now changes nothing. The diner went quiet. Even Earl stopped moving. Annie looked at her mother. Ruth stood straighter despite the ache in her knees. You know what poor people learn? She asked softly. Fear still shows up whether you got money or not. Charles lowered his eyes. Later that evening, everyone returned to the apartment. Daniel spread documents across the kitchen table again. Board records, transfer files, email copies. Emily stood beside him. The meeting is Friday morning, she said. Charles nodded. You walk in with this evidence. We challenge everything. And Andrew? Daniel answered. He'll fight. Charles looked almost relieved. Good. Annie sat nearby doing homework she was not reading. Her eyes kept drifting toward the window. The black SUV remained outside. Protection, wealth, security, things her family had never owned. Ruth noticed. First time we got security outside the building, she said. Mrs. Alvarez leaned through the open door carrying cornbread. Neighborhood's gonna think we hit the lottery. She placed the dish down, then saw the papers. Planning a corporate war? Emily smiled faintly. Something like that. Mrs. Alvarez sat immediately. Nobody questioned it anymore. Charles picked up one document. His eyes stopped. What is this? Daniel looked over. The page showed transfer approvals. Dated 3 days after Charles disappeared. Signed by Andrew. Witnessed by Richard Hale. Charles read silently. Then flipped another page. Another transfer. Another signature. His hand tightened. Annie noticed. What? Charles looked up slowly. He moved my daughter's foundation. Emily froze. The room went still. What foundation? Annie asked. Charles swallowed. Scholarships. Silence. For children with cancer. Ruth lowered the dish towel in her hand. Emily sat down. He touched that too? Charles nodded. The answer broke something in the room. Annie looked at him. The man who lost a daughter had built scholarships. Then lost those too. Mrs. Alvarez quietly crossed herself. Ruth spoke first. You get it back. Everyone looked at her. She nodded toward the papers. You get every bit of it back. Charles looked at her. No. Ruth frowned. No? I rebuild it. The apartment became quiet. He looked at Annie. Different name. Annie blinked. Before she could answer, a knock hit the door. Hard. Everyone stood. Daniel moved first. He opened it. Mr. Hanley stood outside. He looked nervous. Sorry. He held his cap in both hands. Need Ruth. Ruth stepped forward. What happened? The landlord glanced down the hallway. There was a man asking questions. The room went still. What man? Daniel asked. Suit, mid-50s. He looked toward Charles. Asked if a white guy lived here. Andrew. Nobody said it. Mr. Hanley continued. I told him nothing. Ruth nodded. Thank you. He handed over another paper. Rent office notice. Ruth sighed. Mr. Hanley, it ain't bad. He smiled slightly. Office approved extension. Everyone looked up. Ruth blinked. What? 2 more weeks. The room stayed quiet. Mr. Hanley shrugged. Don't know why. He looked toward the black SUV outside. Guess somebody important moved in. Mrs. Alvarez laughed. Charles did not. He looked at the rent paper. Extension approved. 2 weeks. Because of him. Again. After Mr. Hanley left, the apartment quieted. Charles walked to the window. Outside, the security SUV remained. Inside, Ruth folded the extension notice and placed it beside the old rent paper. 2 weeks. Time. The one thing Annie had tried to buy for him in that alley. Charles turned. I'm ending this Friday. Emily looked up. Daniel nodded. Nobody argued. Annie's phone buzzed. One final message. Friday. Boardroom. Don't trust the lawyer. She looked up slowly. Daniel was standing 3 feet away. Friday morning arrived gray and cold. Nobody spoke much during breakfast. Ruth poured coffee. Mrs. Alvarez somehow appeared before 7 carrying muffins and opinions. Emily reviewed documents. Daniel checked his tablet. Annie watched everyone. And Charles stood by the window wearing the same coat he had worn in the alley. Not the expensive suit Emily brought. The old coat. You're really wearing that? Emily asked. Yes. She sighed. Here I'm possible. Mrs. Alvarez nodded proudly. Means he's healing. The board meeting was downtown. Glass building. Steel lobby. Whitman Holdings written across the wall. Annie stopped walking. She remembered the man with bread. This place did not fit him. Or maybe it had once. Inside the elevator, nobody spoke. Daniel finally looked up. We go in. Present evidence. Force emergency review. Annie's phone vibrated. Unknown message. Don't trust the lawyer. She looked at Daniel. He stood beside Emily reviewing notes. Calm. Professional. Normal. The elevator opened. Board members filled the conference room. Andrew Whitman stood at the far end near the windows. Perfect suit. Perfect smile. He looked at Charles. The smile faded. Charles walked in quietly. Every head turned. One board member whispered, My God. Andrew recovered first. Charlie. Charles said nothing. Daniel stepped forward. We're requesting immediate review of executive transfer actions and emergency authority procedures. Andrew smiled. Of course. Too easy. Annie felt it immediately. Something was wrong. Daniel connected his tablet to the screen. Files appeared. Transfers. Approvals. Forgery analysis. The room grew quiet. Andrew remained calm. Then Daniel clicked another file. Access denied. He frowned. Tried again. Denied. Emily stood. What? Daniel checked the folder. Half the documents were gone. The room shifted. Andrew smiled. Charles looked at Daniel. Slowly, quietly. The lawyer looked up. I can explain. Nobody moved. Emily stared. What did you do? Daniel swallowed. Andrew approached me months ago. Silence. He said Charlie needed protection. Emily stepped back. No. Daniel lowered his eyes. I moved documents. The room exploded. Voices. Shouting. Board members stood. Andrew remained still. Charles did not move. Annie watched him. No anger. No surprise. Just disappointment. Daniel looked at him. I'm sorry. Charles nodded once. You should be. Andrew stepped forward. It's over. The room quieted. You disappeared. The company survived. Let it end. Charles looked around. The boardroom. The people. The company. Then Annie. She stood near the wall holding the old scholarship envelope she had carried by habit all week. Suddenly he smiled. Small. Tired. Real. No. Andrew frowned. Charles reached into his coat. Everyone watched. He pulled out folded papers. Old. Wrinkled. Debt settlement receipt and agreement. Emily looked confused. Andrew laughed. What is that? Charles placed it on the table. Proof. Silence. Board members stared. Charles looked at them. A college student paid my debt in an alley. Nobody spoke. She used scholarship money. He looked at Andrew. A stranger gave away her future for me. Annie felt her throat tighten. Charles continued. I built companies. Pause. And she taught me character. The room stayed silent. He looked at the board. You want to know if I'm fit to lead? He pointed at the paper. That receipt is worth more than every contract in this room. Andrew laughed sharply. This is ridiculous. No. Charles looked at him. This is the first honest thing I've brought into this building. Emily quietly placed another folder on the table. Not the first. Everyone turned. She opened it. Original files. Printed copies. Witness statements. Bank records. Daniel wasn't my only lawyer. The room went silent. Andrew's face changed. Emily kept speaking. You thought I trusted one person? Board members leaned forward. Forgery reports. Transfer trails. Foundation movements. Scholarship diversions. Everything. Andrew sat down slowly. The room had turned. One board member stood. We call emergency vote. Another nodded. A third followed. Andrew looked at Charles. For the first time, fear. Hours later it was over. Charles stood outside the building. Wind moved through the street. Emily walked beside him. You got it back. He looked up at the tower. No. She frowned. What? He smiled slightly. I got myself back. Annie stood near the steps with Ruth. Charles walked toward them, then stopped. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folder. Annie frowned. What's that? He handed it over. She opened it. The Annie Carter Scholarship Foundation. Her hands froze. For students carrying more than tuition, Charles said quietly. Rent, food, life. Ruth covered her mouth. Emily smiled. Mrs. Alvarez cried immediately. Annie looked up. You named it after me? Charles nodded. You saved me before you knew who I was. His voice softened. So I'm honoring you now that I know who you are. Annie looked at the folder. Then, at the man who once sat in an alley eating bread, the man who washed dishes, the man who lost everything, and found his way back. Across the street, reporters gathered. Cameras. Question. Noise. Charles ignored all of it. He looked at Ruth. About the rent. Ruth smiled. You still owe me. Everyone laughed. Charles laughed too. Real this time. Then he looked at Annie. $800, he said softly. Changed 2 lives. Annie shook her head. No. She looked at the folder in her hands. More than 2. Sometimes the people who save us are not the powerful ones, but the kind ones. This story reminds us that compassion is never wasted. true character is revealed in hard times, and even a small act of mercy can change lives in ways we never expect. Wealth can be lost and rebuilt, but kindness leaves a legacy that lasts forever. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.